Awakening in the unknown. The harsh glare of fluorescent light stabbed at Brandon's eyelids as he blinked away the remnants of sleep. His head throbbed violently, each pulse sending waves of nausea coursing through his body. He tried to move, but his limbs felt unresponsive, weighed down by an unseen force. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. As his vision slowly cleared, his eyes widened in disbelief. The room surrounding him was like nothing he had ever encountered. Sleek metallic walls arched overhead, pulsating with strange lights and adorned with unfamiliar symbols. Medical devices hummed and beat, their designs both advanced and unsettling. "This can't be real," Brandon mumbled, forcing himself to sit up. The effort made his muscles scream in protest, but he managed to prop himself up on his elbows. His heart raced as he scanned the room, taking in the bizarre atmosphere. Everything felt foreign, like he had stumbled into a sci-fi novel. Just as he was processing the impossibility of it all, he caught sight of her. At the foot of his bed stood a figure who looked like a vision from another world. She was studying a holographic display that floated in midair, her green skin shimmering under the harsh lights. Her long dark hair cascaded down her back, contrasting beautifully with her emerald complexion. The white uniform she wore clung to her figure, accentuating curves that defied earthly standards of beauty. Brandon's jaw dropped, recognition crashing over him like a tidal wave. He knew her. Ren. "Holy," he breathed, astonished. "You're Ren." The alien nurse's head snapped up, her luminous eyes locking onto Brandon's face with a mix of surprise and suspicion. "How do you know my name?" she demanded, her voice a melodious blend of softness and authority. Brandon's mind raced. This was insane. He was living the story he had consumed countless times on YouTube, yet here he was, face to face with the protagonist from his favorite sci-fi saga. But how did he end up in this surreal situation? Why was he here? He needed a quick answer, something to diffuse the tension. "Lucky guess," he offered weakly, attempting a disarming smile. Ren narrowed her eyes, moving closer with a graceful confidence that made his heart race. "You're lying," she stated flatly. "No one here knows my name. Who are you, really?" Brandon swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her scrutiny. Up close, Ren was even more breathtaking. The scent of something floral and exotic filled his nostrils, making it hard to concentrate. "I'm just a guy who took a wrong turn in Albuquerque," he quipped, hoping humor might ease the palpable tension. Ren's lips twitched, almost forming a smile before she caught herself. "Earth? So you are human. Fascinating. We don't get many of your kind out here." "At where exactly?" he asked, straining to sit up further, but his body protested, eliciting a groan from deep within him. Ren's professional demeanor resurfaced. "You've been through quite an ordeal," she said gently, pushing him back down. "You're on Outpost Z9, a medical research station orbiting Proxima Centauri b." Brandon's head spun, not just from the pain but from the gravity of her words. This was real. He was living the story he had listened to so many times. But how much did he dare reveal? "That's a lot to take in," he managed. "Last thing I remember, I was driving home from work. How did I end up here?" Ren's brow furrowed, her expression shifting to one of concern. "We're not entirely sure. Your escape pod was picked up by one of our patrols. You were unconscious, suffering from severe trauma and radiation exposure. It's a miracle you survived." Brandon nodded slowly, piecing together fragments of memory and reality. "And you've been taking care of me." A faint blush colored Ren's cheeks, barely visible against her green skin. "I'm the lead xenobiologist on this station. Your case intrigued me." "I bet it did," Brandon muttered, then quickly added, "I mean, thank you for saving my life." Ren's professional mask slipped for a moment, revealing a hint of vulnerability. "You're welcome, though I must admit you've presented quite the puzzle. Your physiology is unusual, even for a human." Brandon couldn't help but grin. "Oh yeah, Care to elaborate on that, Doc? Wren's eyes widened slightly, a mix of embarrassment and interest flashing across her face. For starters, your cellular regeneration rate is off the charts, and your neural pathways, I've never seen anything like them. Sounds like I'm one of a kind, Brandon teased, enjoying the way Wren's composure faltered. Indeed, she murmured, her gaze lingering on him a moment too long. Clearing her throat, she straightened up. We should run some more tests. Can you stand? Brandon nodded, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. As he did, he became acutely aware that he was wearing nothing but a thin medical gown. He looked up at Wren, raising an eyebrow. Did you dress me in this yourself? Wren's blush deepened. It was a medical necessity, she said primly, but her eyes sparkled with mischief. Of course, Brandon agreed, struggling to keep a straight face. He stood, wobbling slightly. Wren reached out to steady him, her hand brushing against his arm and sending a jolt of electricity through his body. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Let's get you to the scanner, Wren said, breaking the silence, her voice slightly husky. As they made their way across the room, Brandon's mind whirled. He was living a fantasy, but the dangers were all too real. If the story played out as he remembered, this station was in terrible danger. But how could he warn them without sounding insane? Wren helped him onto the examination table, her hands lingering a fraction longer than necessary. This won't hurt a bit, she assured him, activating the scanner. A shimmering field of energy enveloped Brandon, tingling against his skin. He watched Wren as she studied the readouts, her brow furrowed in concentration. Even in her professional mode, she was captivating. Fascinating, Wren murmured, her fingers dancing across the holographic display. Your DNA, it's unlike anything in our database. Brandon couldn't resist a quip. Maybe I'm not the alien here. Maybe you're all the aliens and I'm the normal one. Wren looked up, a genuine smile tugging at her lips. An interesting hypothesis, Mr. Brandon. Brandon Cooper, he supplied, and you can call me Brandon. Mr. Cooper makes me sound like an old man, he joked. Very well, Brandon, Wren said, his name rolling off her tongue in a way that sent shivers down his spine. Care to explain how a normal human ended up halfway across the galaxy? Brandon's mind raced. How much should he reveal? He decided on a version of the truth. Would you believe me if I said I had a premonition about this place? About you? Wren's eyes widened. A premonition? Are you claiming to be psychic? Not exactly, Brandon hedged. More like I had a vision of this station of you. I thought it was just a dream, but now. Wren studied him intently, her scientific curiosity warring with skepticism. That's quite a claim. Do you often have these visions? Brandon shook his head. Never, just this one. And it led me here, to you. The air between them grew charged once more. Wren took a step closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. And what else did this vision show you? Brandon's heart pounded. He knew he was playing with fire, but he couldn't stop himself. Danger, he said softly. This station, it's not safe. There's a threat coming, something that could destroy everything. Wren's expression hardened. What kind of threat? How do you know this? Before Brandon could answer, alarms began blaring throughout the station. Red lights flashed, bathing the room in an ominous glow as an automated voice announced, "Unknown vessel approaching. All personnel report to emergency stations." Wren's eyes widened in shock. She turned to Brandon, her voice a mix of fear and accusation. "How did you know?" Brandon met her gaze, his expression grim. "Because I've seen how this story ends. And unless we do something, it's not going to be pretty." Wren opened her mouth to respond, but another alarm cut her off, this one more urgent. Biohazard alert. Unknown pathogen detected in primary air filtration system. Initiating quarantine protocols. Brandon's blood ran cold. This was it, the beginning of a catastrophe he had heard about in the story. But now he was living it, and the terror on Ren's face made it all too real. "We need to move," he said, grabbing Ren's arm. She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "My lab, we might be able to analyze the pathogen and find a way to stop it." As they raced out of the medical bay, Brandon's mind whirled. He was in over his head, trapped in a sci-fi nightmare come to life. But as he glanced at Ren and saw the determination in her eyes, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could change the ending of this story. The lab and the rising tension. As they sprinted down the metallic corridors of Outpost Z9, the chaos of the emergency alarms faded into a distant murmur, replaced by the pounding of Brandon's heart. The sterile white walls of the facility gleamed ominously under the flickering lights, casting eerie shadows that danced alongside them. Ren led the way with practiced ease, her long strides a testament to her training and determination. Brandon struggled to keep pace, his body still weak from whatever ordeal had brought him here. "How far is your lab?" he panted, glancing around at the stark architecture that felt simultaneously advanced and alien. "Just a few more levels down," Ren replied, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "We need to reach the containment chamber. If the pathogen is as dangerous as you say, we must isolate it before it spreads beyond control." Brandon nodded, but his mind was racing. He could barely wrap his head around the fact that he was living out a narrative he had only imagined before. The potential for disaster loomed larger with each step they took. "What do you think this pathogen is?" he asked, attempting to push aside his anxiety. "How does it work?" Ren glanced back at him, her expression serious. "The pathogen is engineered, likely a bioweapon designed to infect and neutralize any biological life it encounters. From what I gathered from the reports, it has adaptive capabilities that allow it to evolve in response to different hosts. If it infects our personnel, the results could be catastrophic." "Great," Brandon muttered, feeling a chill run down his spine. "So it's like a viral shapeshifter." "Exactly," Ren said, her voice tight. "If it can learn, we need to act quickly. I suspect it was deployed by the vessel that's just arrived, but we can't confirm that until we analyze a sample." They rounded a corner, and Ren gestured for Brandon to follow her through a set of heavy doors that hissed open with a pneumatic sigh. The lab beyond was a marvel of technology, filled with instruments and equipment that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. Holographic displays floated above workstations, projecting data in vivid colors. The air was thick with the scent of chemicals, mingling with the floral undertones that seemed to cling to Ren. "Welcome to my sanctuary," she said with a slight smile, though her eyes were focused on the task ahead. "This is where we can contain and analyze the pathogen." Brandon stepped inside, awestruck by the organized chaos of the lab. "It's amazing," he said, his voice tinged with wonder. "You've got everything here." "Thank you," Ren replied, already moving to a console. Her fingers danced over the controls, and a holographic display sprang to life, showcasing the various functions of the lab. "We need to get a sample from the primary air filtration system. I can deploy a collection drone to retrieve it." "Sounds good," Brandon said, trying to focus on the urgency of the situation rather than the awe he felt. As Ren worked, he glanced around, noticing various scientific equipment designed for a range of tests. His curiosity piqued. He wandered closer to a large microscope. "Careful," Ren warned without looking up. "That microscope is calibrated for multi-species analysis. One wrong move could compromise our results." Brandon stepped back, suddenly aware of how out of his depth he felt. "Right, sorry, just trying to help." Ren's brow furrowed in concentration as she activated the drone control system. "It's okay, Brandon. I appreciate your enthusiasm. It's just that the stakes are incredibly high right now." She paused, her expression softening as she glanced at him. "You've already been through so much." "I'll do whatever it takes," he assured her, a sense of determination swelling within him. "We can't let this station fall victim to whatever this pathogen is." Ren nodded, her eyes flickering with approval. "I admire your courage." Not many would face danger like this so boldly, especially in a situation as dire as ours. As she sent the drone on its mission, Brandon felt a surge of confidence. You know, I've read stories about humans in situations like this. We're pretty resilient. We've survived worse. Ren's gaze turned serious again. This isn't just a story, Brandon. This is real life, and we're in the midst of a crisis. If the pathogen spreads... I know, he interrupted gently, but we have a chance to change things. You're brilliant, and with my unique situation, we might just find a way to stop it. Ren's eyes met his, a flicker of hope illuminating her features. Let's focus on the task at hand. The drone should return shortly with a sample. Moments later, the lab's communication system crackled to life, and the drone's visual feed appeared on the main display. The small cylindrical device hovered gracefully through the station's dimly lit corridors, maneuvering past frantic scientists and flashing emergency lights. Brandon's heart raced as he watched the drone approach the air filtration system, its sensors scanning for the pathogen. "Come on, little guy," he murmured, leaning closer to the screen. The drone activated its collection mechanism, a small needle extending to gather air samples from the filtration unit. Just as it began to retrieve the sample, alarms blared anew, and the station shook with a low rumble. Brandon steadied himself against a counter as the lights flickered ominously. "What was that?" he asked, anxiety creeping back into his voice. Ren's expression hardened as she tapped furiously at the console. "We're losing containment in the lower levels. The pathogen must be spreading faster than we anticipated. If it breaches the lab..." "I'll do what I can to help," Brandon said, the urgency of the situation pushing him into action. "Just tell me what you need." "We need to establish a quarantine perimeter," Ren instructed. "If we can secure this lab, we can work on the pathogen without interference. I'll handle the containment fields. You monitor the drone." "Got it." Brandon nodded, feeling the adrenaline coursing through him. He positioned himself at the drone's console, keeping an eye on the feed as it continued its mission. The drone successfully collected the sample, and Ren's voice cut through the chaos. "Good. Now bring it back here. We need to analyze it immediately." Brandon's heart sank as the drone's feed flickered, revealing a growing panic in the station's corridors. "Ren, it looks like things are getting worse out there. What if the drone can't make it back?" "We can't think like that," Ren replied firmly, her hands moving with purpose over her console. "We need to trust our technology. It has protocols in place for emergencies." Just as she spoke, the lab shook again, stronger this time. The emergency lights dimmed, and the screens flickered ominously. "What the hell is happening?" Brandon exclaimed. "The containment fields are failing," Ren shouted over the din. "If they go down, the pathogen will flood the lab. We need to secure the perimeter, now." Brandon's pulse quickened as he followed Ren's instructions. He grabbed a nearby toolkit and began reinforcing the lab's doors, his hands moving frantically as he felt the tension mounting around them. "We can't let this happen," he murmured to himself, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. "I'm working on it," Ren replied, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "If we can hold them off for a few more minutes, the drone will be back with the sample." With each tremor of the station, the tension in the air grew thicker. Brandon felt the gravity of their situation pressing down on him as he and Ren worked side by side, each contributing to their shared goal. The bond they were forging in this moment was palpable, a blend of fear, hope, and determination. Finally, the drone's feed flickered to life once more, revealing its return journey. Brandon's breath caught in his throat as he saw the swerving lights of panic beyond the lab. "It's coming back," he shouted. Ren turned just in time to see the drone glide through the lab doors, a small vial containing the precious pathogen sample clutched in its mechanical grasp. "Yes," she exclaimed, her face lighting up with triumph. But the victory was short-lived. As the drone settled on the counter, the alarms reached a deafening crescendo, and a voice crackled over the intercom, "Evacuate immediately. Containment failure imminent." "Brandon, Wren's voice sliced through his thoughts as she rushed to his side. We need to analyze the sample, but we also need to prepare for an evacuation. With the clock ticking, they turned their attention to the holographic displays, the data revealing the full extent of the pathogen's threat. It's evolving rapidly, Wren said, her fingers flying over the controls. If we can find its weaknesses, we might be able to develop a countermeasure before we have to leave. Brandon leaned in closer, determined to contribute. Can we combine our DNA with the sample to see how it reacts? Wren looked up, her eyes wide with realization. That could work. If we can identify the specific markers in your DNA that give you resilience, we might be able to craft an antidote. Let's do it, Brandon said, adrenaline fueling his resolve. Whatever it takes to save this station and everyone on it. As they prepared for the analysis, the walls shook again, a reminder of the chaos unfolding beyond their fragile sanctuary. Brandon could feel the tension in Wren's posture, a mixture of fear and determination reflected in her emerald eyes. Together, she said, her voice steady. We can do this. Together, Brandon echoed, feeling the gravity of their shared mission. In this moment, their fates were intertwined, united by a common purpose. As they began the analysis, the world outside their lab faded away, and all that mattered was the fight against the encroaching darkness threatening to engulf them both. The race against time. The atmosphere in the lab was thick with tension as Brandon and Wren prepared to analyze the pathogen sample. The alarms blared relentlessly, filling the air with an urgent sense of dread. Brandon could feel the weight of the impending crisis pressing down on him, a constant reminder that every second counted. Wren's fingers flew over the holographic controls, her focus unwavering despite the chaos surrounding them. Ready the analyzer, she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. We need to determine the pathogen's structure and its vulnerabilities. Brandon moved to assist her, feeling a surge of adrenaline as he focused on the task at hand. What do we need to do? He asked, his heart pounding in sync with the blaring alarms. Activate the DNA sequencer, Wren replied, her emerald eyes locking onto his. We'll compare the sample's genetic makeup against your own. If we can identify the differences, we might find a way to exploit the pathogen's weaknesses. Brandon nodded, the gravity of their task settling over him. Let's do this. As the sequencer powered up, the room was filled with a soft whirring sound, accompanied by a series of flashing lights. Brandon watched the holographic display come to life, revealing a three-dimensional representation of the pathogen's structure. It was unlike anything he had seen before, an intricate web of spiraling strands that shimmered with an eerie glow. Look at this, Wren said, pointing at the display. It's evolving rapidly. Each iteration is slightly different from the last, adapting to its environment. Brandon leaned closer, his brow furrowing in concentration. So, it's like it's learning from its surroundings. Exactly, Wren affirmed, her voice steady. That's what makes it so dangerous. If we can't figure out how to stop it quickly, it could wipe out the entire station. Let's get to work, then Brandon said, feeling a surge of determination. He was here for a reason, and he wasn't going to let fear dictate the outcome. They were humanity's last hope against this alien menace, and he would do whatever it took to ensure their survival. As they worked side by side, Wren's fingers danced across the controls, her expertise evident in every movement. Brandon couldn't help but admire her dedication. There was a fierce determination in her that inspired him to push through the fear clawing at his insides. What do you need from me? He asked, eager to contribute. Once we have the initial analysis, I'll need a blood sample from you to compare your unique DNA with the pathogen, she explained, glancing at him with an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. Your cellular regeneration rate and neural pathways may hold the key to finding an antidote. Let's do it, he replied, his resolve solidifying. The alarms continued to blare, but in that moment, the world outside faded away. It was just him, Wren, and the looming threat of the pathogen. The sequencer whirred to life, displaying intricate patterns and sequences that seemed to pulse with energy. Brandon watched in awe as Ren navigated through the data, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This is it," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're getting close." Suddenly, the lab shook violently, sending instruments rattling across the countertops. "What was that?" Brandon shouted, grabbing onto the edge of the console for support. "It's the containment breach," Ren said, her voice tense. "We need to hurry." As the screens flashed ominously, a warning signal blared. "Containment protocols failing. Immediate action required," the automated voice announced, sending a chill down Brandon's spine. "Ren, we need to secure the lab," he urged, looking around frantically. "If the pathogen escapes, we're done for." "I'm on it," she shouted back, her fingers racing over the controls as she activated the emergency lockdown procedures. Heavy metal shutters began to close over the lab entrances, sealing them off from the outside world. "This should hold for a while, but we need to work fast." Brandon returned his focus to the analysis, his heart racing as he felt the urgency of their situation. "What's our timeline?" he asked, glancing at the screens displaying the pathogen's data. Ren looked up, her expression grave. "If we don't find a solution within the next 30 minutes, the pathogen will likely breach the lab. Once that happens, it could spread through the entire station in mere hours." "Then let's find its weaknesses," Brandon urged, feeling a fierce determination swell within him. "What's the next step?" Ren's eyes flickered with gratitude, and for a brief moment, the fear seemed to lift. "We need to compare your DNA with the pathogens. I'll need to extract a sample from you, but it's a straightforward procedure, just a small blood draw." "Let's do it," he replied, his heart pounding with both anxiety and resolve. "Whatever it takes." Ren retrieved a medical kit from one of the counters, her movements precise and efficient. "Okay, this will only take a moment." She prepared the instruments with a steady hand, and Brandon could feel his heartbeat quickening in anticipation. "Just a little prick," she assured him as she swabbed his arm with antiseptic. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, sending a jolt of warmth through him. He tried to focus on the task ahead, but the proximity of her body and the intensity of the moment made it difficult to concentrate. As Ren drew the blood sample, their eyes met, and the air seemed to crackle with tension. "You're doing great," she encouraged, her voice soothing. "Just breathe." "Right," he said, trying to quell the rush of thoughts racing through his mind. He felt a slight sting as the needle pierced his skin, but the pain was negligible compared to the urgency of their situation. He couldn't help but admire her focus as she worked, her brow furrowed in concentration. With the blood sample collected, Ren quickly moved back to the analyzer, placing the vial next to the pathogen sample. "Now let's see what we can find," she said, her fingers flying over the controls once more. The screens lit up with information, displaying intricate comparisons between Brandon's DNA and the pathogen's structure. As the data processed, Brandon's heart raced with anticipation. "What are we looking for?" he asked. "Any genetic markers that could indicate a resistance to the pathogen," Ren explained, her eyes scanning the data intently. "If we can identify those markers, we might be able to synthesize an antidote that targets the pathogen specifically." Minutes ticked by, each second feeling like an eternity as they watched the data unfold. Come on," Brandon urged under his breath, his anxiety mounting as the alarms continued to wail around them. Finally, the analyzer chimed, and a series of graphs appeared on the screen. "Yes," Ren exclaimed, her eyes widening in excitement. "Look at this." Brandon leaned closer, his heart racing. The display showed a series of genetic sequences, some matching between his DNA and the pathogen, while others stood out as anomalies. "What does it mean?" he asked, hope blooming in his chest. Ren's fingers moved deftly over the controls, isolating the key sequences. "These markers here," she said, pointing at the screen, "they suggest that your cellular structure has a unique regeneration capability that the pathogen struggles to adapt to. If we can isolate this property, we might be able to create an antidote. Brandon felt a surge of hope. So we can stop it. It's a possibility, Ren replied, her voice steady but filled with determination. But we need to act quickly. I'll need to create a synthesis based on these findings, but I can't do it alone. We need to gather more materials from the lab. Tell me what you need, he said, adrenaline coursing through his veins. I'll get it. Ren quickly listed the necessary items, specific reagents, vials, and a centrifuge. Brandon moved swiftly around the lab, grabbing everything she requested and returning to her side. The urgency of the situation spurred him on, every moment feeling like a race against time. As they worked together, Brandon felt a sense of camaraderie building between them. The crisis had forged an unspoken bond, a partnership born from necessity and courage. We can do this, Ren, he said, meeting her gaze. We just have to believe we can find a way. I know we can, she replied, a fierce determination in her eyes. We just have to keep pushing forward. With the materials gathered, Ren set to work, her movements confident and precise as she combined the substances needed to create the antidote. Brandon watched, his heart racing as she mixed the reagents, the colors swirling together in a mesmerizing dance. Just a few more adjustments, she murmured, her brow furrowed in concentration. If we can stabilize the synthesis, we'll be ready for testing. But just as hope began to blossom in Brandon's chest, the alarms reached a deafening crescendo. Warning. Containment failure imminent. All personnel evacuate immediately. The automated voice echoed throughout the lab, sending chills down his spine. Ren, we don't have much time, he shouted, panic rising within him. What do we do? Finish the synthesis, she ordered, her voice steady despite the chaos. I'll activate the emergency override to seal the lab. We need to hold off the pathogen for just a bit longer. Brandon's hands moved with purpose as he assisted her, feeling the urgency of their task pressing down on him. Together, they worked in perfect sync, their shared determination fueling their resolve. With each passing second, the threat loomed larger, and they both understood that failure was not an option. As Ren completed the synthesis, she carefully poured the glowing liquid into vials, her hands steady despite the chaos surrounding them. We're ready, she said, looking at Brandon with fierce determination. Now we need to test it before we evacuate. Let's do it, he replied, his heart pounding in his chest. Together, they prepared for the most critical moment of their mission, knowing that the fate of the station, and perhaps all of humanity, rested on their shoulders. The first test. As the alarms blared around them, the urgency in the lab became palpable. The atmosphere was thick with tension as Brandon and Ren prepared to conduct the first test of the antidote. Time was slipping away, and the threat of the pathogen loomed larger than ever. The flickering lights cast strange shadows across the room, making it feel as if the very walls were closing in. Are you ready for this? Ren asked, her emerald eyes locked onto Brandon's, searching for reassurance. Brandon nodded, feeling a surge of determination. We have to try. There's no turning back now. The gravity of their situation pressed down on him, but he could sense the resolve in Ren, a fierce fire that mirrored his own. Together, they were fighting not just for their lives, but for the survival of everyone aboard Outpost EZ-9. Ren meticulously prepared the testing equipment, her hands moving with practiced precision. The antidote should work by targeting the pathogen's adaptive capabilities, she explained, her voice steady despite the chaos outside. If it succeeds, we'll see a significant reduction in the pathogen's viability. Let's hope it does, Brandon said, trying to mask the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. He took a deep breath, grounding himself in the moment. What's our plan if it doesn't? Ren met his gaze, her expression unwavering. We'll have to think on our feet. If this fails, we'll need to find another way to contain the pathogen, but we're not going to let it come to that. We can do this. With the setup complete, they moved to the central console, where a small vial containing the synthesized antidote awaited its moment of truth. Ren activated the holographic display, and the screen lit up with a real-time analysis of the pathogen's activity in the lab environment. "This is our chance," she said, her voice a mixture of hope and urgency. "Let's see how the antidote interacts with the pathogen." Brandon took a step closer, his heart racing as he watched the holographic representation of the pathogen pulse and swirl on the screen. "It looks alive," he murmured, a mixture of awe and dread filling him. "It is," Ren confirmed, her eyes focused on the data. "And that's what makes it so dangerous. It's adapting as we speak, likely sensing our efforts to combat it." Brandon clenched his fists, a surge of anger coursing through him. "We can't let it win. We've come too far." With a final nod, Ren prepared to administer the antidote. "Here goes nothing," she said, her voice steady as she carefully injected the antidote into a sample of the pathogen. They both leaned forward, eyes glued to the display, anticipation coursing through the air like static electricity. At first, nothing happened. The pathogen continued to swirl and pulse, seemingly unaffected. Brandon's heart sank, a sense of despair creeping in. "Is it working?" he asked, the anxiety thick in his throat. But then, almost imperceptibly, the pathogen began to change. The colors shifted, its vibrant hues tinning as it struggled against the antidote. "Look," Ren exclaimed, her voice rising with excitement. "It's reacting." As the pathogen fought against the antidote, the holographic display began to show fluctuations in its structure. "It's losing stability," Ren said, her fingers flying over the console. "This is incredible." Brandon watched in awe as the pathogen's adaptive sequences faltered, its once fluid movements becoming erratic and sluggish. "Can it really work?" he breathed, hope blossoming in his chest. "We need to monitor it closely," Ren said, her focus unwavering. "This reaction is promising, but we can't let our guard down. The pathogen could still find a way to adapt." Minutes passed like hours as they observed the interaction. The pathogen's structure continued to deteriorate, and Ren's excitement grew. "If we can maintain this momentum, we might have a viable antidote." Brandon felt a swell of pride as he watched Ren work. Her determination was infectious, and he found himself drawn into the moment, the fear and doubt melting away. "We're really doing this," he said, glancing at her. Just then, the lab shook again, a violent tremor that rattled the instruments around them. "Not now," Ren shouted, her expression fierce. "Stay focused." The alarms blared louder, drowning out their thoughts as the automated voice echoed through the lab. "Containment breach in Sector B, evacuate immediately." "Ren, we can't let it escape," Brandon shouted over the noise, feeling the urgency rise within him. "I know," she replied, her eyes darting between the screens. "We need to complete the analysis. If this works, we can create enough antidote to contain the pathogen for good." The pathogen began to pulse erratically, its movements becoming more frantic. "It's trying to fight back," Brandon warned, feeling a rush of adrenaline. "What do we do?" "Keep monitoring the levels. If it stabilizes, we'll extract more and begin mass synthesis," Ren commanded, her focus unwavering despite the chaos outside. Brandon's heart raced as he followed her lead, keeping a watchful eye on the display. The pathogen's structure wavered, teetering on the brink of collapse. "It's losing ground," he said, his voice filled with hope. "We can do this." As they continued their analysis, Brandon's mind raced with thoughts of the lives at stake. Each second felt like a countdown, and he could almost hear the clock ticking down to a moment that could change everything. "We need to hurry," he urged, glancing at Ren. "What's next?" "Once we confirm the antidote's effectiveness, we'll need to replicate it quickly," she replied, her fingers flying over the console. "If we can create enough vials, we can administer it to anyone exposed to the pathogen." Brandon felt a surge of determination. "Then let's make it happen." But just as they were about to secure the antidote's success, the lab shook once more, this time more violently. Instruments fell from the shelves, crashing to the floor as the alarms blared with renewed intensity. "We're running out of time," Ren shouted, her voice rising above the chaos. "We can't give up now." Brandon yelled back, his heart pounding. "We've come too far." With a final push, Ren concentrated on the data, pouring all her energy into securing the antidote's efficacy. "Almost there," she urged, her voice steady as she monitored the readouts. Finally, the screen flashed a notification: "Antidote successful." Brandon let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We did it," he exclaimed, the realization flooding him with relief and triumph. "Now we need to make more." Ren nodded, her expression serious. "We'll need to stabilize the synthesis process for mass production. I'll set up the necessary protocols." Just as she turned back to the console, a deafening crash echoed through the lab. The heavy doors shuddered violently as something slammed against them from the outside. "What was that?" Brandon shouted, fear creeping back into his chest. "I don't know," Ren replied, her brow furrowed in concern. "It's as if the pathogen is trying to breach the lab." "Then we need to secure the doors." Brandon rushed to assist her, his mind racing with thoughts of what could happen if they failed. The weight of their mission bore down on him as he felt the urgency intensifying. Together, they reinforced the lab's entrances, their movements frantic as they prepared for whatever was coming. "We can't let it escape," Brandon said, his voice filled with determination. "We have to hold the line." "I'm initiating lockdown protocols," Ren called out, her fingers flying over the controls as she activated the security measures. Heavy metal shutters began to descend, sealing off the entrances. "This should buy us some time." Brandon glanced at the monitors, watching the data flow as the pathogen continued to pulse on the screens. "We need to keep analyzing the samples," he urged, adrenaline coursing through him. "If we can understand how it's trying to breach our defenses, we might find a way to stop it." With the lab secured for the moment, they returned to the analysis, their eyes fixed on the screens. "Let's see if we can pinpoint its weaknesses," Ren said, her voice steady as she resumed their work. "If we can find a way to destabilize it further, we might be able to contain it." As they worked, the tension in the air thickened. The alarms continued to blare, but their focus remained on the task at hand. With each passing moment, Brandon felt the weight of their mission settle deeper into his bones. They were on the front lines of a battle against an unseen enemy, and they wouldn't back down. Together, they would fight to protect their home, their station, and each other. As the pathogen raged outside, they steeled themselves to the fight ahead, knowing that the fate of everyone on Outpost Z9 depended on their resolve. Breach and counterattack. The lab was a fortress, but it felt increasingly like a ticking time bomb. The alarms blared in a relentless cacophony, the flashing lights creating an eerie atmosphere that was at once both thrilling and terrifying. Brandon and Ren stood shoulder to shoulder, staring at the holographic displays that displayed the pathogen's frantic attempts to breach the lab's defenses. "Look at this," Ren said, pointing at the screen where the pathogen's structure continued to shift and adapt. "It's learning how to counter our security measures. If we don't act fast, it could find a way in." Brandon's stomach dropped as he considered the implications. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice laced with urgency. Ren's expression was resolute. "We need to implement the emergency response protocol. We can use the lab's defenses to create a temporary barrier while we work on synthesizing more of the antidote. But we also need to prepare for a possible breach." "Let's do it," Brandon replied, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "What do you need from me?" "Start prepping the secondary synthesis chamber," Ren instructed, her voice steady as she guided him to the next set of controls. "We'll need to increase production as quickly as possible." Brandon moved swiftly, his hands flying over the controls as he activated the synthesis chamber. The machine worked to life, the familiar hum reassuring him in the chaos. "It's ready," he called back, glancing over his shoulder at Ren. "Good," she replied, her gaze never leaving the pathogen readouts. "Now let's see if we can understand how it's trying to breach our defenses. If we can pinpoint its vulnerabilities, we might have a chance to contain it before it overwhelms us." They both focused on the holographic display, watching as the pathogen adapted, its shape-shifting in real time. Brandon could feel the tension in the air, a palpable energy that heightened his senses. There, he pointed, seeing a pattern in the pathogen's behavior. It's attempting to focus its attack on the weaker points of the containment field. Ren's eyes lit up with realization. Exactly. If we can reinforce those areas, we can buy ourselves more time. Let's initiate a countermeasure program to strengthen the containment fields. Brandon nodded, his heart racing as he followed her lead. On it, he replied, navigating through the controls to reinforce the weak points. The machines whirred and hummed around them, their combined efforts creating a shield that flickered but held strong against the pathogen's assault. As they worked in sync, the lab shook once more, a violent tremor that rattled the instruments and sent a jolt of adrenaline through Brandon. "We need to hurry," he shouted, glancing at Ren. "It's getting worse." "Almost done," Ren replied, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Just a few more adjustments, and we'll be ready." With every second that ticked away, the pathogen's attacks grew more aggressive. The alarms intensified, creating a frantic backdrop to their desperate efforts. Brandon felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Failure was not an option. Finally, with a triumphant flourish, Ren activated the new containment protocols. "It's done," she announced, her eyes shining with determination. "Now, let's see if it holds." The pathogen lashed out again, but this time the reinforced fields held strong, the vibrant colors dimming as it struggled against the barriers. "It's working," Brandon exclaimed, a wave of relief washing over him. "Good, but we need to keep producing the antidote," Ren said, her focus unwavering. "The longer we can contain it, the more time we'll have to synthesize enough to protect everyone on the station." Brandon nodded, diving back into the synthesis process. He worked feverishly, his hands moving with a newfound urgency as he prepared the materials. The hum of the machines became a comforting backdrop, a rhythm that helped him focus despite the chaos swirling around them. Just as they were gaining momentum, the lab shook again, but this time the force was stronger, sending equipment clattering to the floor. "What was that?" Brandon shouted, panic flooding his voice. "It's breached the outer defenses." Ren's voice was urgent. "We need to activate the emergency lockdown for all entrances. Now." Brandon raced to the controls, his heart pounding as he initiated the lockdown sequence. The heavy metal shutters began to descend, sealing off the lab from the outside world. But even as they secured their position, the reality of their situation loomed large. "We can't hold out forever," he said, fear creeping into his voice. "What happens if it gets through?" Ren turned to him, her expression fierce. "We won't let that happen. We're going to fight this thing with everything we've got." The words ignited a fire within Brandon. He had come too far to back down now. "Right," he said, taking a deep breath. "Let's focus on getting that antidote ready for mass production." They worked tirelessly, the tension in the air thickening with each passing moment. Ren guided him through the processes, her expertise shining through as they navigated the complexities of the synthesis. "If we can produce enough antidote quickly, we can deploy it to all personnel in the station before it spreads," she urged, her voice steady and calm amidst the storm. Brandon focused on her words, feeling the adrenaline coursing through his veins. They were in this together, battling against an unseen enemy. He caught Ren's eye for a fleeting moment, and he saw the determination reflected there, a spark of hope in the face of overwhelming odds. Just then, the alarms blared even louder, drowning out their thoughts. "Warning. Containment failure in progress. All personnel must evacuate immediately," the automated voice echoed, sending chills down Brandon's spine. "No, we can't evacuate," he shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. "We need to stay here and fight." Ren's expression was grim as she turned back to the display, her fingers flying over the controls. "We don't have a choice, Brandon. If it breaches this lab, we'll lose everything. We have to find a way to contain it and protect the rest of the station." But how? He asked, fear gnawing at him. What if we can't hold it off? Ren met his gaze, her expression fierce. We will hold it off. We're going to make it through this, together. Now let's focus on what we can do. With that, they pushed aside their fear and focused on the task at hand. They worked together, their movements synchronized as they continued to produce the antidote. With each vial they filled, the hope that had been ignited in Brandon began to grow, a flame that fueled their determination to see this through. Almost there, Ren urged, her fingers flying over the controls. Just a few more vials, and we'll have enough to deploy. As they worked, the lab shook again, the alarms blaring even louder. Brandon's heart raced as he felt the ground tremble beneath him. We need to hurry, he shouted, his urgency fueling their pace. Finally, as the last vial was filled, Ren turned to him, her eyes shining with determination. We did it, she said, a sense of triumph in her voice. Now what? Brandon asked, glancing at the countdown timer on the screen. Now we deploy the antidote to the air filtration system, Ren explained, her voice steady. If we can release it into the air, we can neutralize the pathogen before it spreads further. Let's do it, Brandon replied, adrenaline surging through him once more. They raced to the control panel, and Ren began initiating the release protocol. The air grew thick with anticipation as the countdown continued. 5, 4, 3. Brandon counted down with her, his heart racing. 2, 1. Releasing antidote, Ren announced, her voice ringing with determination. As the antidote was released into the air filtration system, they watched the holographic display with bated breath. The pathogen's activity began to wane, its frantic movements slowing as the antidote began to take effect. It's working, Brandon shouted, a wave of relief washing over him. But just as hope began to bloom, the alarms blared one last time, echoing through the lab. Containment failure imminent. All personnel must evacuate immediately. Ren, we need to get out of here, Brandon urged, panic rising in his chest. We can't abandon our post, she shouted back, her eyes wide with determination. Not now. We have to see this through. Brandon felt torn between the urgency of escape and the need to protect the station. What if we can't hold it off, he pleaded. Ren's gaze locked onto his, fierce and unwavering. We can't think like that. We've already come this far, and we're not going to let it win. We fight together. With that, Brandon felt the weight of her resolve settle over him, grounding him in the moment. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenges ahead. All right, he said, his voice steady. Let's do this together. They returned their focus to the displays, monitoring the pathogen's reaction to the antidote. As the seconds ticked by, they could see the vibrant colors dimming, the pathogen struggling against the effects of the antidote. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the alarms began to fade, and the frantic warnings turned into a steady hum. It's stabilizing, Ren shouted, her eyes lighting up with excitement. We did it, Brandon. Brandon felt a surge of triumph as they both turned to the screen, the holographic display showing the pathogen diminishing in size and intensity. We actually did it, he said, a sense of disbelief washing over him. Yes, Ren beamed, her joy infectious. We saved the station. But their victory was short-lived as the ground shook once more, stronger than before. Instruments rattled on the shelves, and the lights flickered ominously. What now? Brandon shouted, panic creeping back into his voice. The containment fields are failing, Ren exclaimed, her voice filled with urgency. We need to evacuate now. Brandon nodded, adrenaline surging through him as they raced to the lab's exit. Let's go, he urged, determination fueling their movements. They'd burst through the heavy doors, ready to face whatever awaited them in the chaos outside. As they stepped into the corridor, they were met with a scene of chaos. Scientists and personnel rushed past, fear etched on their faces as they tried to evacuate. Alarms blared, and the lights flickered as the station shook again. Over here. Brandon shouted, grabbing Ren's hand to guide her through the turmoil. "We need to find a safe route to the escape pods." Together, they navigated the throng of panicked personnel, their hearts pounding as they pushed forward. "We can't let it take anyone else," Ren shouted, her determination cutting through the chaos. "We have to make it to the escape pods." As they rushed through the corridor, they could see the glowing escape pod bay ahead, a beacon of hope amidst the chaos. "We're almost there," Brandon urged, his pulse racing. Just then, a deafening crash echoed through the station, and the lights went out, plunging them into darkness. "What the hell?" Brandon shouted, panic rising in his chest. "Stay close," Ren yelled, her voice filled with urgency. "We have to keep moving." Together, they pushed through the darkness, their hands clasped tightly as they navigated the obstacles in their path. Brandon could feel the heat radiating from the walls, a reminder of the danger they were in. Finally, they reached the escape pod bay, the dim emergency lights casting eerie shadows across the room. "This way," Ren shouted, leading Brandon toward the nearest pod. They clambered inside, their breaths coming in quick gasps. Ren quickly began activating the controls, her fingers flying over the buttons as the pod powered up. "We're almost ready," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos outside. As the pod hummed to life, Brandon glanced back at the door, fear tightening in his chest. "What if it gets in here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ren turned to him, her expression fierce. "We'll be fine," she assured him. "We've come too far to let it win now." With a final burst of energy, the escape pod doors sealed shut, and the countdown began. 5, 4, 3. Ren's voice rang out, the sound echoing in the small space. "Let's get out of here," Brandon shouted, adrenaline surging through him as they prepared for launch. The countdown continued, and the tension in the air was palpable. 2, 1, launch, Ren exclaimed, and the pod jolted forward, propelled into the darkness of space. As they hurtled away from the chaos of Outpost Z9, Brandon felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. They had escaped, but the battle was far from over. The pathogen was still out there, and they would need to regroup and strategize if they were to save the station and everyone on board. Turning to Ren, he saw the determination in her eyes. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with awe. "Together," she replied, her smile fierce. "And together, we'll find a way to stop it for good."